Hey everyone, I'm going to be honest, I think that Oreos are kinda mid. I mean everyone is like, the cream is better, no the cookie is better, no you guys don't get it, they complete each other, light cannot be whole without darkness and shit like that. And I'm just like, I don't know, it's whatever, you know. Like it's not even a snack that's good enough to warrant this conversation, and I know people are gonna be like, oh but Sarp, you know, it might normally be C tier, but if you dunk it in milk it seriously bumps it to an S. Oh yeah? You mean like every single cookie in existence? Every goddamn cereal I can think of straight out of the packet tastes better than Oreos, and they were specifically made to be consumed with milk. But what does all of this have to do with Dark Souls? Nothing. There is no connection. There is no analogy here or a callback to this conversation at the end of the video. This is not sarcastic, I am 100% serious. I couldn't possibly be in the mood or mindset for joking right now as I'm writing this because I'm honestly at my wit's end. I'm actually tired of FromSoft games. Or rather not the games really, but the constant bickering they cause all over the internet. Like they release not even a new game now but a fucking expansion pack, and that's all I'm seeing and hearing about on the internet for the next 3 months with nowhere to escape. It's like the AI of gaming, and yet here I am making a whole video about Dark Souls 3 of all things. But let me tell you that it was definitely not what I had intended at the start. I don't know if you've been here for a while or if you're a new viewer, but I began a new series this year called Backlog Bonfire. These are long audio only segments where I casually talk about all the games I played that don't get their individual review videos or essays. The first episode ended with Dark Souls 1 and 2 because I had yet to play Dark Souls 3 at the time and I wanted to get the episode out before that. Now, one thing to note here is that unlike any of my other videos, I tried making that video without a script but just a few bullet points about each game on hand. And I was really not satisfied with how utterly dogshit it ended up being compared to my other stuff. So I've decided that I would fully write what I had to say for each game as I kept going through my backlog for the next episode, starting with Dark Souls 3 of course. And due to what I've just complained about regarding FromSoft games, I wasn't really too excited to write about Dark Souls 3, but I nevertheless began and then it got out of hand. That part got so long and I realized I had so much I wanted to say about the game that I expanded on that part a bit more and it's now its own video. But as you all know, there are probably more Dark Souls essays on this website than there are sand grains in the Sahara Desert. Because of this, I genuinely couldn't find any good or interesting way to start this video. You know, you'd normally want to start with a really powerful intro to set the tone, establish the topic, and hook the watchers with an interesting question or hypothesis. The rest of the video could be generic as hell, but if you can somehow make people commit to watching more than just 5 minutes of your slop, then they're probably going to stay for the rest anyway. However, we're talking about fucking Dark Souls here. There is no way any wacky intro I could come up with about these games hasn't already been done to death. And the people coming in to see this video has probably already watched like 50 others about Guinevere's feat just today. Hence, I decided on an intro completely unrelated to Dark Souls, hence the Oreo bit. Should be uncommon enough, even though I'm not trusting for a second that a Dark Souls video which begins with a tangent about Oreos hasn't been done before. I mean, there are videos about Hotline Miami piss on this website for fuck's sake. Everything has already been done before, so I've given up on my dreams of ever being able to come up with something truly original, which means that I can talk about Dark Souls. Now, I do still have some principles for the videos I make. Contrary to what my last few reviews might tell you, I don't just pick out what would get the most clicks amongst stuff that I play. If I'm making an individual video on a game, it usually means one or more of these three things. One, I think that my perspective can bring something new to the table. This could be because I'm a newcomer to a long established and beloved series who doesn't see things the way veterans of it do, for instance. Two, I think that the game is a severely overlooked hidden gem that deserves more eyes on it. And three, the game just ends up being really special to me. Now, I think we're all aware that no Dark Souls game is an underrated hidden gem. I don't care if you love these games more than your own mother, and I wouldn't actually be surprised if some of you did say that to me, but you're not fucking telling me that these games aren't talked about enough. There is no world in which I'm having that. This leaves us with the other two reasons, and they both apply here. Believe it or not, I only played through the trilogy for the first time this year, but it's not just that. Otherwise, I would have done individual videos about the first two games as well after all. But something about Dark Souls 3 stuck with me much more than anything in the first two games. So without further ado, let's get into it. You're all probably already aware of this, but ending things is difficult. There are only so many series that do it right, and it's kind of a shame since a poorly executed final installment or episode leaves a bad taste in the mouth no matter how well executed everything was before. Game of Thrones, Dead Space 3, Third Birthday, the list goes on and on. Of course, not all of them try to end things and fumble in the first place. Sometimes a sequel or season is not planned as the final chapter at all, but more just never comes after them, so the franchise kind of remains in this inconclusive limbo. Other times it does attempt at an ending and actually nails it, but more of it comes after anyway because the franchise is just too profitable to let go. It happened to Toy Story and is about to happen to it again. It happened to Five Nights at Freddy's like 4 times. This all tells us that not only is ending things difficult, but there are also 2 separate layers to it. The first is to actually nail a well executed ending, and the second is to commit to it. The latter sounds easier than the former, but it can be really tricky to let go of something you put so much of your time, effort, heart and soul into. And what's even trickier is that it's up to so many other people as well besides just the creators. Die-hard fans, and especially investors if you have any, are not always so accepting, no matter how much you hit them in the face with it. Like, there are still people out there that want a Hotline Miami 3 and think that the sequel bait at the end of the second game is actually genuine. So with all of that being said, how could you possibly properly end a behemoth like Dark Souls? I don't actually know any details about how the development of Dark Souls 3 went, but I can't imagine anything but that being the biggest concern with the game during that whole process. The series had already changed the entire gaming ecosystem by this point. It had changed how we talked about games, what we liked or disliked most about games, and how other publishers and developers responded to this shift with their own games. The end of Dark Souls had to be the end of an era, and all of us from FromSoft and their fans to the rest of the world had to move on. And after playing Dark Souls 3, I'm happy to say that not only does the final product somehow end up meeting those impossible expectations, but it does it in a way that feels much more different than your typical conclusion. It's not only a fitting and satisfying final act for the series, but also a fascinating conversation between it and the player. And that's what I fell in love with. I think it shapes the identity of Dark Souls 3 more than anything else in it. It's what makes the game more than the sum of its parts, just as the first 2 games were. I've already gone over what I liked and disliked about them in the first Backlog Bonfire episode, focusing on each aspect individually from the lore to the boss rosters. But it's not really what stack of positives and negatives a Souls game has to offer, but the core blueprint which gives it a personality unlike anything else on the market. Everyone has their beloved and hated parts of these games. Some like certain areas while others don't. Some struggle with certain bosses while others beat them first try. Some like to be invaders while some like to be protectors. Others say fuck all of that noise and play offline. They don't see any messages and thus receive no info on upcoming ambushes, invisible walls and so much more, which further differs their experience from those playing online beyond just PvP. Some players like to be agile and constantly jump around while others like to hit slower but very hard. Some roll through every attack while some block all of them with a great shield, and others just simply keep their distance while casting long range spells. And finally, as you all know, some would rather shove a rusty nail down their urethra instead of summoning help for a fight and losing their true gamer status, while others would seize every opportunity for jolly cooperation. This is why I don't subscribe to the idea that Dark Souls games are only designed to cater to a certain type of player profile, or that there is a specific intended method of play while others are shortcuts or exploits. Whether you like it or not, these games tend to aim for and have much wider appeal than most discourse around them would have you believe. There is a template for sure, with firekeepers, Estus flasks, blacksmiths and the like being constants in every player's story, but how the rest of the journey is built upon that foundation is very personal. Everything is so open-ended for a game that is not an outright sandbox, that all of it, from how the fights play out and which areas are explored in what order, to how the story goes for everyone you meet along the way and which of them are willing to aid you in your battles, are determined by your playstyle and your rules, whatever they may be. In other words, beneath all their labels, from the Git Good games that are for hardcore players only, to the genre they gave birth to called Souls-like, Dark Souls games at their core are exactly what they were marketed as at their inception: action RPGs. A very specific and exceptionally well-made kind that made them the industry juggernauts they are, but RPGs nonetheless. You're supposed to play according to what you find to be the most fun and what you value the most in an experience, whether that's challenge, friendship, wonder, or a mix of all and more, and you'll have your own story to tell by the end because of it. It might be a story of how you chucked 15 firebombs at a tough enemy from a safe distance once you ran out of Estus, of how you accidentally wasted a divine blessing on Pinwheel of all things, of how how you watched the legendary Black Iron Tarkus knock a giant golem off a cliff for you, or of how you beat Fume Knight at level 1 just with your fists and Weltstadt's helm. No matter who likes it or not, no matter how difficult or easy it is, it's your own journey and you decide how it goes. With that being said, I'd be lying if I said any of the Dark Souls games are among my favorites. None of them are among the games I spent the most hours playing either, or the games that affected me the most deeply or helped me get through a dark episode of my life. They are, however, still special, because they feel like nothing else I've ever played thanks to a combination of grandness and an emphasis on my actions rather than those of the game. To exemplify this with the first title, it feels like playing a Homeric epic, a legend of the chosen undead who traveled to the divine city of Anor Londo for the Lord Vessel and defeated the 4 lords to feed their souls into it so that he could travel the path to the Kiln of the First Flame, where he faced the old Lord of Cinder Gwyn and sacrificed himself to rekindle the First Flame. It is thanks to him that we are still living in an age of light. His tale is still told at gatherings by those that were fortunate enough to meet him and even fight by his side. I know it doesn't sound so complex or impressive when I tell it like this, but in my experience, it's actually much more common for games to have their hero feel like a part of a world that would just go on fine without them, or have them be a savior in the shadows, their heroics only recognized by those closest to them and unknown to everyone else. Very few have their hero traverse and fight through such a diverse array of places and biomes either. And even if that grandness is found, it's more defined by how the game presents itself rather than how the player presents themselves. God of War 2018, for instance, is a game I adore, but I only remember what I fought rather than how I fought them, because that rarely changed. Sure, I used different runic attacks and combo strings for different bosses maybe, or maybe not. Like I said, I don't really remember how I fought them because it never felt that different even if it was. And don't get me wrong, I didn't always utilize all the different options on my hand in Dark Souls either. Most times I just stuck to what I know in fact. But I distinctly remember each time that mold did break and I did something I usually wouldn't do. I remember each time I summoned a guy, each time I used fire bombs to kill an enemy, each time I cast a toxic cloud pyromancy, each time I parried a boss, each time I knocked a tough enemy off a cliff, each time I changed my weapon or equipment for a section, each time I really shouldn't have survived but did, and each time I should have survived but didn't. This is what I was trying to say earlier with Souls games being more than the sum of their parts and their stack of positive and negative design choices. It's the combination of this enormous world that you can feel is alive and has a rich history while traversing it, just by clues like environmental storytelling, even if you're not piecing together all the lore pieces, and a scenario written for you to follow whose direction is so fine-tuned that it puts you on a set path, gives you a motivation and a set of tasks to complete, but leaves just enough room so that you can go about it your own way. And this is why we keep going back to these games, either in thought like I'm doing here, or quite literally with yet another playthrough as if the first 5 weren't enough. We keep trying to relive those memories of triumph, respite and camaraderie, and make more of them by altering the conditions without having to step into the terrifying unknown that much. Because everything surrounding us is still the same even if our approach is different. We're still experimenting in a safe environment. It's that sweet spot we humans like so much, where just enough changes introduced to save us from our boring routine, but not so much that we're uncomfortable. Now, it is true that no game can be for absolutely everyone, no matter how much it attempts to provide player freedom, and these games will thus never be what some players are looking for either. No matter what kind of playstyle they try, it might feel too slow, too difficult, or too obtuse. They may just not click with the vibe, the combat, the navigation, or any other mechanic or design decision you can think of. But for the rest of us, it triggers all the right parts of the brain, so much so that we can't let go despite all the parts of it we hate, like Lost Islet and Horsefuck Valley. But is that really something beautiful like I'm making it sound now, or is it something rotten like I mentioned at the beginning? An obsession that nibbles away more and more of what was once special, and maybe even makes it all seem dull after a while. During my first hours of Dark Souls 3, I was kind of disillusioned with the game. I wouldn't say that I was outright bored, but there certainly wasn't the same excitement I had felt with the first 2 games. There was probably the fatigue of playing all 3 games back to back at Play 2, but most of my exhaustion had to do with things I still would have thought about the game otherwise as well. Here's yet another ruined kingdom and yet another fire to link. Here's the firekeeper lady that'll level me up. Here's the Uchigatana I know and love right at the beginning, and here's my favorite blacksmith Andre to sharpen it with titanite. It's all the same song and dance for a third time, and there's no charm charm at all by now. Compared to that young, bright-eyed adventurer I was in Dark Souls 1, always wondering what I would come across next in this mysterious world, I'm like a jaded old man now, just going through the motions as the game desperately tries to hype me up again with cheap nostalgia bait like Siegmeyer's Son or Lucatill's Mask. Or at least, that's what I thought at first. It is probably the most common criticism against Dark Souls 3 I've seen on the internet, that it relies too heavily on fan service to hook players in, and it just causes the opposite, making these familiar places and faces feel old and tired. But that's because the world is old and tired by now, which is kind of the whole theme. Dark Souls 3 doesn't become better as it introduces new things, but as you realize how it reintroduces old things. When you see an Orlando from the bottom of that staircase and a pair of silver knights appear to give you a warm welcome, there's really no reason to look for anything deeper than what's right in front of your face. Just good old An Orlando. But it is when you go inside that you really see it for what it has become. In Dark Souls 1, even after breaking Gwyndolin's illusion, there was still a graceful, orderly silence in the city even without its godly golden filter. An Orlando stood out as a sterile, stainless city, away from the stench and filth of places like the disease-ridden Blighttown and the submerged corpse mounds of New Londo ruins. But here, it is no different than any of those places. Its halls are covered in disgusting masses of slime, roamed by monstrous creatures covered in disheveled fur and the remains of its victims. Its new residents are mad cultists, worshipping an amorphous blob that's half-digested the last godly resident of the once graceful city and is now playing with their corpse like a chewing toy. And it's not just An Orlando, but also its most iconic figure that shares the same fate too. From Dragon Slayer Ornstein to Old Dragon Slayer and to now just Dragon Slayer armor. It is an autonomous hollow armor set, not even golden like it once was. It's a literal husk of its former self, an animated corpse of Ornstein, and that's the point. Dark Souls 3 is on your side. It's so sick of itself, so tired of stagnating endlessly in this farcical age prolonged over and over by adventurer after adventurer linking that same stupid fucking flame. There's hardly anything left to even rot, as the world itself is now sharing the same fate as its countless residents, going hollow. Its newest form of corruption, the pus of man, doesn't even resemble anything or even serve much of a purpose lore-wise, which is shocking at first, since the enemy designs and lore have always been some of the strongest aspects of Souls games for me. They can be so weird and out there, complex yet coherent and purposeful as well. They made this world feel alive, but it's on its last legs now and you still have the audacity to ask it for more rather than just giving it the peace it deserves. It's amorphous blobs and rehashed ideas everywhere because it's run out of things to give you, and it's not like it wants to give you anything in the first place. In fact, I read all this so-called fan service as an outburst, as the world lashing out against its abuser, throwing everything it can get its hands on at their head. You like Ornstein? Fucking have what's left of him. You want Smo too? Buy his whole armor set straight from the shop. And while we're at it, why don't you have Havel too? Here, I'll even put a fucking dragon corpse next to him. What does it matter anymore? Oh, what's that? Still not satisfied? You want more? How about another snowy fucking painting with a sight lady at the end as DLC? I could go on and analyze all these little decisions critically. I could do what I always do and talk about how much I loved that area or hated that boss fight, but none of that's as important as how it all fits, whether it's intentional or not. With all its obtuse directions, camera issues, frustrating poison swamps, brilliant level design, impeccable lore and vast player freedom, it's all Dark Souls for the third time, and it's tired of that. Even all the steps you need to take this time to get to the first flame reflect this, as the new lords you need to slay have all either already linked the fire before or were supposed to link it and refused. They were all called here once more for the same mission and they're not being cooperative this time, which is why you're here to persuade them. Aldrich is too preoccupied with his church and insatiable hunger. The Abyss Watchers are too far gone to concern themselves with anything but their self-destructive madness. Yorm is sulking miserably in the lonely throne room of his destroyed kingdom, while the princes of Lothric are holed up in their own, hiding behind barricades and many other layers of security so that no one could bother them with all this rekindling nonsense again. They're all actively refusing their roles as the sacrificial pawns of yet another tired cycle, as the expected main bosses of yet another Souls game, until you barge in and forcefully drag them back into it because you're the only one left that can't let it go. This is not a grand celebration of the series, it's more like someone that's about to go to retirement realizing they've been working the same job, going through the same routine for their whole life. I don't know if this is like actually statistically the case, but Dark Souls 3 even feels more colorless than the previous two games. Like when I think of Anor Londo, The Archives, Darkroot Garden or Crystal Caves from the first game, I remember green, blue and yellow. Likewise, when I think of Majula, Hate's Tower of Flame or the Iron Keep from the second game, I remember green, yellow and red that were all a nice break from the relatively more prominent brown and grey of these games. But when I think of Dark Souls 3, all I remember is brown and grey. Even the few outlier areas like Iritil and its dungeon felt like there was this filter on them that still made them mildly greyer than they were supposed to be. And in most other scenarios, I would be talking about this as a negative, but here, combined with everything else I've talked about, it's kind of brilliant because it's the most Dark Souls way to go out. We always think of something climactic for a fitting end, whether it's an inspiring, bombastic and triumphant victory or a harrowing failure. But the world of Dark Souls was always doomed not to a flashy and instant mass destruction, but to a slow and agonizing crawl towards its death due to the obsessions of its so-called heroes and lords. The signs have always been there from the start, but now they're fucking billboards, and they're advertising for the Ringed City DLC, the very last Dark Souls content FromSoft has ever made, arguably, but we'll come to that. For now, I want to talk about how the DLC itself builds upon the base game's themes. Once again, I could say many things here about the stuff in this expansion that I liked and disliked, but the most important thing is that not only does it remain committed to the base game's vision, but actually doubles down on it, which is immediately visible as soon as you enter the DLC. We are instantly hit with the view of the whole world basically already dead and crumbling to dust at this point, as this endless mass of collapsed cities and kingdoms are spiraling down into the endless abyss at an agonizingly slow pace. And I can't think of a better name than Drake Heap for this enormous, lifeless pile of ash and ruins. The Ringed City that we reach afterwards seems relatively more intact still. Even the swamp it leads to is not poisonous for a change, but it's all barely held together by strings and duct tape, which even its residents are aware of. Fear not the end, they say, as you make your way to the final room and just barely touch the half-shattered hollow orb that Filianor is clutching, which finally shatters it completely. This results in exactly what you would expect by now. The world is finally completely dead, and all there is left on its corpse are two madmen. Even after everything is gone, Slave Knight Gale is still roaming this endless desert of ash, looking for that pigment for his lady's painting. And similarly, you're still here as well, even when there's nothing left for you. Your endless desire for more to do, your constant need to see what's next, has brought you all the way here, not even to the end but past it. I said just moments before that it wouldn't be fitting for Dark Souls 3 to end with a climactic bang, but it actually does and somehow proves me wrong. There is finally no more misery to be prolonged. The world has already left its final breath after who knows how many more ages of suffering that we have just skipped past. There is no room left for further collapse, no possible way to erase even more colors until it's all the same grey. It already is. The only option left is also the only thing these two men know. Blinded by their obsessions, terrifyingly indifferent to the wishes and pains of anyone or anything besides themselves, they would destroy the world a second time if they could, all in the name of getting what they seek. Gale seeks our Dark Soul, and we seek a great final boss for Dark Souls. I kept hearing about this battle all the time before playing the game. I have heard so many people calling Gale the best boss in the whole series, and if I were to look at the fight itself in a vacuum, I wouldn't really understand why that's so universally agreed upon. Yes, it's a great fight, but there have been ones before it that I found to be more enjoyable. It's not the most interesting fight in the series, nor is it the most personal or the most difficult. In fact, I would call it kind of middling in terms of all those aspects. But with the context behind it, there is no contest. It even perfectly lines up with the endings of the previous two games, where the final bosses were only that not because they were the most powerful, but only because their obsessions matched ours. Gwyn had hollowed in his endless struggle to keep the Fire Age going forever, and Nashandra has absolutely no regrets having dragged kingdoms into all-out war and immense suffering for her goals when you face her in front of what's literally called the Throne of Want. Yes, the world slowly hollowing and unceremoniously crumbling into dust would certainly be a Dark Souls way to go out, but what what would even be more Dark Souls is two men still screaming and going all out at each other after they've destroyed literally everything else. After hours and hours of witnessing things slowly reduce to zero, it all immediately goes back to 100 in this final crescendo. The sky goes dark, there's thunder striking everywhere, the music is beyond incredible, and my man pulls out a fucking auto crossbow firing it mid-air and shit. It's the sort of climax that not only hits harder because of everything that had led up to it, but also gives all of it meaning, makes it so that it wasn't all just for this dead desert at the end. There might be nothing left now after the fight is over, but the interesting thing about its conclusion is that both of you have actually succeeded. You had your climactic boss fight and beat it, while Gale left you what he was trying to gather as pigment for his lady's painting all this time, the blood of the Dark Soul. Which brings us to the last thing I want to discuss in this video. When you give the pigment to the painter, she says that she will use it to paint a new world, which at its core is the final thing that solidifies Dark Souls 3 as the end, now saying it directly that there is nothing left here and it's time to move on to something new. But there are multiple ways to interpret what that new thing is supposed to be, and that's where I'm feeling conflicted. The painter says that the new world will be a cold, dark and gentle place, and that's not really helpful for singling out either of the new FromSoft IPs that came after Dark Souls 3, as it doesn't wholly apply to either of them. Besides, Sekiro was in development at the time, so the painter could have been referring to that, but Elden Ring's development also began right after the release of the Ring City according to Miyazaki, so both games were already conceptualized at the time. Thus, I think what would be the most useful is to instead focus on that important key element we have struggled so hard to get for the painter, the blood of the Dark Soul. This implies to me that although it may be a completely new setting, this new world is still meant to have the DNA of Dark Souls, and Elden Ring is easily the more similar game to Dark Souls between the two. It makes sense not only when we look at the link metaphorically but literally as well, since Elden Ring shares not only a lot of the same design principles as Dark Souls, but also things that are straight up supposed to belong to it, like good old patches for instance, but it doesn't feel quite right. Now, this isn't to criticize Elden Ring as a game, not only because I'm not qualified for that since I haven't played it myself yet and just seen chunks of it, but also because it seems like a game that I would probably enjoy considering how my experience with Dark Souls has been. However, its mere existence feels sort of antithetical to everything I thought Dark Souls 3 was telling me. Sure, it is technically not Dark Souls, but with its themes, mechanics, plot similarities, architecture, structure and much more based on what I've seen, it's kind of like Dark Souls 4 and 5 together as one big open world game with a horse. And that kind of feels wrong after Dark Souls 3. I haven't played Sekiro yet either, but based on what I've seen from it, that's really more the type of new game I would have expected after Dark Souls 3. Even if it's not as prominent as it is with Elden Ring, there are still some familiar patterns to recognize here. The healing system, the different endings, the curse of immortality, how characters speak and act. The Souls DNA is still there and recognizable, but what's built upon it is completely different. A brand new direction that takes the RPG out of those action RPGs and capitalizes the word action. It is bold, brash, tight, and it's bound to make some people very unhappy while others ecstatic because it's so vastly different. But that's how change works, and we saw what happens when things refuse to change for ages in Dark Souls 3, so I can't shake off the feeling that it's been betrayed by its fans and creators. We got one game that left the old formula and ushered in something new, and then it never even got a DLC like its predecessors before we went back to more Dark Souls under a different name. Because once again, ending things is difficult, especially when it comes to a behemoth like Dark Souls. We get obsessed and we just can't let it go. Before I end the video, I want to re-emphasize that even though I worded it so strongly at the end there, that feeling of betrayal is still just a feeling, and I'll make my final judgment after I play Sekiro and Elden Ring as well. Part of me actually wanted to make this video after that, but it'll probably be quite a while until then, and as the title suggests, I just really needed to talk about Dark Souls 3. So with all of that being said, as always, take care of yourselves and thank you for watching.